Thank God it's Friday. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us on the program. I am Nifemi Oguntoye. President Tinubu yesterday met with China's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Wang Yi, at the State House, and is called on quite a number of things, one of which is asking China to expand the $2 billion currency swap agreement it has with Nigeria in order to boost bilateral trade and also appeal for an upward revision of the $50 billion aid package for Africa that was announced by the Chinese president last year. We're going to be talking a lot about that, the fact that the China foreign minister chooses to visit Africa first in its diplomatic missions, and that's a tradition they've kept for quite a number of years, over 30 years now. But we'll begin the conversation this morning by paying tribute to Jimmy Carter, the 39th U.S. president, whose state funeral held yesterday at the Washington National Cathedral, gathering political figures across board who turned out to celebrate a statesman whose impact resonated globally and who's now been remembered as the one who redefined U.S. post-presidency with his dedication to faith and public service. All 5 of his living presidential successors were in attendance, and the animated conversation that you just saw there between Donald Trump and Barack Obama has left many highly curious as to what exactly they were whispering about. At some point, Barack Obama was laughing to what Donald Trump was telling him. Jimmy Carter died at the age of 100 years old, making him the longest-lived president in U.S. history. The other U.S. president who lived that long was George H.W. Bush, who died in 2018, I think at the age of 94. So now Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and Joe Biden, who were all present yesterday, can now dream to break that record. But according to a U.S. geriatrician, that's a doctor who attends to older adults, they say approximately 10% of people have the potential to reach the age of 100 in the U.S. So it is such a remarkable feat. And some scientists have said longevity like this stems from a complex interplay of genetics, lifestyle habits, environmental factors, and luck. Interestingly, Jimmy Carter was the first sitting U.S. president to visit Nigeria. He was hosted in 1978 by the then military head of state, Lieutenant General Olusegun Obasanjo in Lagos. Chief Obasanjo had visited him in Washington, D.C. 5 months earlier in a visit that was described as a diplomatic success at the time. So let's say perhaps he returned the favor. Joining me to have this conversation live from Geneva in Switzerland as former Nigerian Deputy Permanent Representative to the United Nations, Ambassador Usman Saraki. Ambassador Saraki, thank you for joining us and Happy New Year to you.
Thank you, Mr. Oguntoye. Good morning to you and to fellow Nigerians, and Happy New Year to you. Thank you for having me on your program today.
Thank you so much for joining us. I'd like us to start on a light note. They say only about 10% of people, I think in the U.S., have the potential to reach the age of 100. Are there lessons of longevity we can take from the School of Carter in this regard?
Yes, I think, devotion to God and humanitarian causes give certain satisfaction to the mind, the body, and the spirit that makes the person endure tribulations and challenges and even diseases. And in that way, an active mind actually is a recipe for a strong body. And that was what Jimmy Carter represented. In 40 years or more after his presidency, he devoted his life and time and endeavors towards humanitarian efforts, towards peace and progress, economic development, democracy, and human rights. And in the process, he wrote, surprisingly, about 33 books. So that is quite a lot of achievement. And having a very prolific mind, it keeps the body healthy and remarkably active. And I think that is the secret of his longevity. And secondly, his spiritual beliefs. He was a Baptist Christian. Very devoted Christian, very devoted man of God, somebody who feared, the consequences of ill will and evil in the world. And that permeated his policy as a president and even afterwards when he left office. So these are things that we should look and learn. And don't forget that he went back to his farm when he left the presidency to farm and to be active. So he was mentally and physically, bodily, he was an active person until the last moment he left this earth.
Absolutely. He became more popular for his post-presidency activities that you highlighted, his humanitarian work, and also the fact that him and his wife founded Carter Center, where they promoted human rights and devoted their lives to easing suffering across the world. They dedicated that time to building, renovating, and repairing over 4,000 homes across 14 countries in their lifetime. Let's talk about his relationship with Rosalynn, his wife. They shared 77 years of marriage. They say it's the longest in presidential history. Is that some sort of a secret? If you agree to it, good marital life perhaps can extend your life?
Yes, certainly. I think, happiness at home is the beginning of a healthy life. And his marriage with Rosalynn, which actually represented the rural background, was the beginning of the confidence that he had as a politician, really, to run for, Georgia House of Assembly or the Congress, and then to governor, and then actually to run for president. That relationship actually, presented him the pedestal, the pillar or the foundation, if you like, to look outside the family, outside his community, outside his state and the southern part of the U.S., to say that, look, the spiritual values that I imbibed as a Baptist Christian, and also my family life as a rural person, I can project those values onto the national and global stage to bring harmony, peace, and happiness to people. And I think that marriage and the fact that he had those lovely children, and we saw his grandson yesterday delivering the eulogy, in honor of his grandfather. So those family ties were the embodiment of the linkages that he had with his people, with his community, with his country, and with the larger world. And that was why he became so sympathetic to the causes of people in Africa, in Palestine, in other parts of the world, to highlight the sufferings and challenges of people. When a person suffers, it is a family that suffers. And I think that was the background that informed his humanitarian activities.
Absolutely. So he survived by 5 living successors, former U.S. presidents, including Joe Biden, all of which we saw at the funeral yesterday. It's a tricky guess, Ambassador. Do you think we will see any of them break that 100-year record in our lifetime?
Well, Joe Biden is on the way.
Absolutely.
Hopefully, if he remains healthy and active. And Barack Obama, he's very physically fit, spiritually, also somebody who is focused in terms of family values and so forth, and intellectually also very sharp, and active. So these two, I think, and Clinton too, remember, he is also now in the old age bracket, and Donald Trump also. The American system caters for their presidents, and absolutely the highest degree of health care and well-being. So I think we will expect all 5 of them to, by the grace of God, to be around for some more years.
Let's talk about his relationship with Africa. He was the first U.S. president to make a state visit to Nigeria and sub-Saharan Africa. At that time, he declared that the day of the so-called ugly American is over, acknowledging that America perhaps had neglected Africa for so long. He visited Nigeria in 1978. There were conversations as regards strengthening the U.S. relations with African nations. The conversations at the time, were around African liberation movements, promoting U.S. interest on the continent, and what have you. But how would you say Jimmy Carter's presidency impacted on Nigeria-U.S. relations as we know it today?
Well, I think, he came into office in 1978, but let us go a little way back to 1975, during the Gerald Ford administration in America. And that was the height of the anti-colonial struggle in Angola, in Mozambique, and also in Namibia, and the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa when it's beginning to gain momentum. Gerald Ford sent emissaries to African presidents, and very imperiously, peremptorily, almost like a dictation, to tell them to support the Western-backed movements, like anti-colonial movements in Angola, led by Jonas Savimbi, and not the MPLA, led by Agostinho Neto. Now, Murtala Mohammed at that time, General Murtala Mohammed, was the head of state, and he refused to really go by what the Americans wanted him to do. And you remember he went to Addis Ababa at the OAU heads of state and government meeting and declared famously that Africa's fortunes were for Africans to make or to mar.
Indeed.
That position defined very critically the position of Nigeria towards the liberation struggle in Africa. But that was even before, that was after actually, Sawabukar Tafawa established the foundation for the anti-colonial, non-aligned position in terms of our foreign policy. So there is a continuum of foreign policy doctrine in Nigeria from the 60s to the 70s up to the point when President Olusegun Obasanjo took power.
Okay.
Now, Jimmy Carter, coming from the Georgia background, knowing the damages and the moral consequences of slavery and also racial discrimination in America, he came with the belief that all human beings are equal. They were born equal, and racial discrimination, racism, was an evil. And on that basis, I think he saw Africa in a different light from the other presidents that came before him. And that is why he declared that America had neglected Africa for too long. And he declared that supporting the independence of Zimbabwe from white-dominated colonial rule was the most significant thing that America had done. And these are really things that Africans should not forget. They are very, very momentous, very historic, and very revolutionary.
Indeed.
When we look at the context of the United States of American politics at that time, during the Cold War era.
And I'm glad that we have you this morning to have that conversation, because I understand that you were critical to the formulation of our foreign policy itself, years back. Jimmy Carter's visit was quite brief, but it's said to have a lasting impact on our relations with America. The emphasis at the time was on liberation, as you've mentioned, the struggles for majority rule in countries like Rhodesia, that's now Zimbabwe and South Africa. But how do you see, how have the interests evolved over the years from what the U.S. interest was, those years?
Yes, in those years, in the 70s, remember, that the Cold War was raging, really. And the arms reduction talks and other things were taking place to douse tension and to reduce the threat or the accidents of nuclear war. And Africa was central to the Cold War to win hearts and minds of Africans. Liberation struggles were beginning to really gain momentum. Armed struggle in Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, Angola, Mozambique, Namibia was beginning to organize under SWAPO, and ANC too was actually beginning to engage in armed struggle from the neighboring countries. So the situation in Africa was very critical at that time. And the Cold War mentality of the American establishment refused to see the positive aspects of liberation of Africa. And in fact, it insisted on retaining the privileges of the white minority regimes in all these countries for the economic benefit. But President Carter agreed with African heads of state and government that the situation would no longer be tenable in terms of having a minority white racist governments in power in Angola, Mozambique, Namibia, and South Africa. And he aligned himself with the aspirations of Africa, drawing from the spiritual background that he was brought up in Georgia, where discrimination against black people was rampant, which he repudiated in his lifetime by really appointing people like Andrew Yang and recognizing the civil rights movement and empowering black people in the United States of America. So his presidency was a decisive moment in terms of the liberation of Africa and the reshaping of the global policy towards the continent. Unhappily today, we are back to a situation whereby the Cold War mentality of maximizing of positions and of advantages in Africa is beginning to resurface, especially vis-a-vis relationship between the Western countries and China and Russia. And the scramble, the second so-called scramble, for African resources, and as we are seeing playing out today.
Absolutely. We're going to touch on that when we turn our attention to our relations with China that appears to have flourished tremendously over the years. But the former U.S. president was known for his emphasis on human rights and democracy. Do you think his administration's policies in any way influenced Nigeria's transition to democracy?
Yes, I think it did, because, you see, national affairs are invariably impacted upon by global affairs. And there was a trend now in the 70s towards actually, the democratization of the world in terms of spreading the values of democracy and human rights. And the American establishment at that time went about doing that from the Cold War prism, the Cold War mentality. But when President Jimmy Carter came into office, he looked at Africa and said, we can relate with these people, this continent, on the basis of equality, on the basis of empathy, on the basis of understanding, not from the point of view of condescension. And that really endeared him personally to African leaders, and it allowed Africans to receive his message with open mind, open heart, and also to know or to realize that democracy was a virtuous principle if it can be applied in our continent. And the wind of change continued even after he left office, when he dedicated his time not only to humanitarian causes, but also to the fact of promoting human rights, human dignity, and democracy in our continent and other places. I remember he actually participated more in peace processes in countries like South Sudan, in Bosnia, in Cuba, in Haiti, in Zimbabwe, in South Africa, and other places, and even in Namibia, towards really bringing about reconciliation, ending of armed combat and conflicts and so forth. So his legacy in Africa is very tremendous. And I think let us recall that there was a book written by Nancy Mitchell titled Carter in Africa. And I think it's very important that we should get hold of this book to read, to see what this man of God, this amiable gentleman had done for Africa.
He also broke out the historic Camp David Accords between Israel and Egypt. And I'm wondering, as a seasoned diplomat yourself, what lessons you think we can learn from his diplomatic approach, especially as it concerns his emphasis on human rights and conflict resolution?
In diplomacy, I think it's very important to have a neutral position if you want to broker a deal or peace between two conflicting parties. Today, or the last 30 years, for instance, we could not get traction or momentum towards resolution of the Israel-Palestine conflict because of the lack of neutrality on the part of America and the Western world. They solidly affirmed their support for Israel, right or wrong, and today we have seen the devastation that has been meted on the people of Gaza by America standing firmly with Israel. If we have had a position whereby the American president will say, look, I'm on the side of peace, I'm on the side of humanity. I'm on the side of human rights. I'm on the side of self-determination. Come, let us sit down and talk. I will be an impartial broker. I think the Oslo Agreement would have been implemented. And by now, this bloodshed, this conflict, this terrible disaster unfolding before our very eyes would not have taken place. Jimmy Carter approached Egypt and Israel and told them, you are neighbors. You are tied by the umbilical cord of history and geography. No matter how much you fight, no matter for how long you fight, one day you have to seek reconciliation because of the factor of history and geography. And I think that made it possible for Anwar Sadat and the Israeli Prime Minister at that time, Menachem Begin, I think, to sit down to say, look, yes, we can agree. Let us have peace between us. And that was what happened. So today, Mr. Gunter, the world needs statesmen, not politicians. I'm sad to say. We don't have statesmen today. What we have are politicians who are interested in what the headlines of the television, CNN or BBC or Washington Post and New York Times will say tomorrow. That is the short-sighted nature of politics today. Statesmen look at history beyond their point of departure from the world. What will the world say after I have left? And I think Jimmy Carter was one of such rare gems of people who looked beyond tomorrow's headline to actually think about what the world will say about him after he leaves the world. And that is the legacy today we are discussing, of being a statesman.
Indeed.
And a really consummate diplomat to bring about reconciliation between two unlikely foes.
Indeed.
That he brokered and brought about peace that has endured, surprisingly, up till this moment between Egypt and Israel.
Ambassador, I think we all agree that Jimmy Carter's legacy continues to shape Nigeria-U.S. relations today. You have also highlighted the opportunities it presented, but what do you consider the challenges that arise from this legacy?
Well, the challenges that arise are those of ideology. The American establishment today is steeped in ideology of liberalism. And by ideology of liberalism, I mean the ideology that drives tendencies like the LGBT phenomena, and insisting that Africa must liberalize the human rights space, the political space, the civil society space, for us to accommodate aberrant behaviors that are not in tandem with our cultural customs and religious beliefs. They are insisting that we must make abortion, for instance, available across the board for every woman who wants to do it, regardless of the circumstances or situation. They are telling us that we should teach sexual orientation and other practices in our school, even from kindergarten to primary and upwards to other levels of education. These ideological tendencies are marring the relationship between Africa and the U.S. And on the other hand, looking at the economic relationship between Africa and the Western world, particularly the United States, there is really very little to write home about in terms of concrete, substantial, demonstrable evidence of the facilitation of the economic development of Africa. Yes, there is investment here and there in areas like supporting private sector and so forth. But when it comes to the critical question of infrastructure development, industrialization, and opening up of markets for African products, you find reluctance and conflicting attitudes from one administration to the other. And I think, when President Donald Trump comes into office in a few weeks' time, we may see a seesaw sort of change of behavior toward Africa that may not be conducive to a sustenance of relationship in a positive manner between us and the United States of America. But Jimmy Carter, he learned about the situation in Africa by reading, by informing himself of Africa, by bringing scholars around him to inform him about the situation in Africa. and they allowed him to make up his mind independently from the information that he gathered. And economic development, hand in hand with liberation and democratization and human rights, were the priorities that he pursued in Africa. Yes. And when he left, the Guinea Worm Crusade, or the anti-Guinea Worm Crusade, became a hallmark of his life and efforts after leaving office.
Interestingly, he was one of the first people to give early support to pro-gay legislation and embrace LGBT advocates. In fact, they say he moved
but he never pushed it down the throat of other countries. Like Obama and Clinton and Hillary Clinton.
Attempted to, exactly.
But currently, Joe Biden tried to do in Ghana, in Uganda, in Nigeria, in other countries of Africa. So I think that is a dividing line ideologically between America and Africa. We may be pro-human rights, that is all right, but human rights is actually not something alien to Africa. At least as far as we are concerned, we have had our regimes of human rights a long time before even we came in contact with the Western world. And the continuation of those practices may not be Western or modern, some of our practices, but they are not actually fundamental, antithetical to the enjoyment of human rights. So by bringing those doctrines onto us, they seem to really create certain challenges in the running of smooth relationship between, or the smooth running of relationship between us and the United States of America.
Let's take a short break, Ambassador. When we return, we'll turn our attention to Nigeria's relations with China. China's foreign minister met with President Tinubu yesterday, and it's in continuation of a tradition we've seen over 30 years of visiting Africa first in their diplomatic travels in the year. Stay with us, everyone. Don't go away.